Part 7. The opening of Japan, Western sound arrives. And so, the old and the new stood side by side. Temple bells still echoed. Shamisen strings still sang. But beyond the horizon, another sound was drawing closer. Not yet fully heard, not yet fully understood, just approaching. In the middle of the 19th century, Japan had lived for centuries in relative isolation. Its music had grown inward, refined, layered, deeply rooted in its own aesthetic logic. Silence was meaningful. Space was sacred. Melody moved horizontally like a brushstroke across paper. But the sea does not remain silent forever. And in 1853, black ships appeared on the horizon. They came not only with trade agreements and diplomatic pressure. They came with brass, with drums arranged in formation, with marching rhythms that moved not in curves, but in straight lines. Western military bands performed on deck and on shore. Trumpets cut sharply through the air. Snare drums snapped with mechanical precision. Harmony stacked upward, note upon note, forming structures unfamiliar to Japanese ears. For those listening, the experience must have felt overwhelming. Where was the pause? Where was the lingering breath between tones? Where was the subtle bend of a note, searching gently for resolution? Western harmony did not drift. It advanced, confident, layered, full. It filled space that Japanese music had long allowed to remain open. And yet, curiosity stirred. Some listeners leaned closer, not in rejection, but in wonder. The sheer weight of the sound, multiple voices moving at once, suggested a different way of organizing emotion. Not quieter, not louder, just different. As treaties were signed and ports were opened, Western instruments began to appear on land. Clarinets, cornets, pianos carefully unloaded from ships, each one carrying not only a sound, but a system, notation, scales, rules of progression. Music was no longer only transmitted by memory. It could be written, standardized, replicated precisely. This concept alone marked a turning point. In the early years, the two musical worlds remained separate. Western bands performed for official ceremonies, diplomatic gatherings, military demonstrations. Traditional musicians continued their art in theaters, in temples, in festivals. The sounds did not yet blend. They coexisted like two languages spoken in the same city, but rarely in the same sentence. Then came the Meiji Restoration, a moment of deliberate transformation. Japan did not simply react to the West, it studied it systematically. Education was restructured, uniforms redesigned, architecture reimagined, and music became part of that reform. Western music was introduced into schools. Military training adopted European band traditions. Young students learned to read notation, to sing in unison, to follow a conductor's raised hand. For children accustomed to folk melodies and temple chants, this new music must have felt disciplined, linear, structured in ways unfamiliar. Yet, repetition breeds familiarity, and soon Western tonal systems began to feel less foreign. The piano's keys, once mysterious, became approachable, predictable, even comforting. Still, the transformation was not one of erasure. Traditional scales did not vanish. Folk festivals continued. The shamisen did not fall silent. Instead, a slow process began. A quiet negotiation between worlds. Japanese musicians listened carefully. They asked, what can be adopted? What must remain? How can something foreign become something meaningful? It is easy to imagine change as abrupt, but cultural transformation is rarely sudden. It seeps gradually into classrooms, into military parades, into private homes where a single piano stands near sliding paper doors. At first, awkward, then natural. Consider the contrast. A no performance, measured, deliberate, rooted in centuries of stillness, and nearby, a Western march, brisk, energetic, forward-moving, two different conceptions of time, two different relationships to silence, yet both capable of stirring emotion, both capable of discipline, both capable of beauty. As decades passed, the boundary softened. Japanese composers would soon attempt something unprecedented, to write in Western forms, yet infuse them with Japanese sensibility. But that is a story unfolding in the next chapter. For now, we remain at the threshold, at the moment when exposure becomes curiosity, when curiosity becomes study, when study becomes transformation. Close your eyes. Imagine a quiet harbor at dusk, traditional wooden buildings lining the shore, a distant temple bell fading into evening air, and then, faintly, a brass instrument testing its tone, A single sustained note, steady and unwavering, not bending, not drifting, just present. Two sonic worlds sharing the same horizon, not yet merged, not yet reconciled, but listening to one another. Rest here in that delicate balance between preservation and possibility, between the familiar cadence of temple drums and the structured advance of marching feet. The opening of Japan was not only political, it was acoustic, a widening of the ear, and once a culture begins to listen differently, its future begins to change gently, inevitably. And so the story continues, not in conflict, but in conversation. Part 8. School songs and military bands. The conversation had begun, not in loud debate, but in careful listening. Temple bells still rang at dusk. Shamisen strings still trembled in quiet rooms. But now, another rhythm was learning to march across the same soil. In the early years of the Meiji era, change was no longer distant. It was deliberate. Japan did not merely hear Western sound. It studied it, systematically, carefully, with intention. Music entered classrooms, not as entertainment, but as education. Children gathered in wooden schoolhouses, their voices rising together in melodies newly written, songs with clear harmony, clear rhythm, clear direction. Unlike the free-flowing patterns of folk music, these songs moved forward with purpose, line by line, measure by measure. For many students, this was their first encounter with written notation, black marks on white paper, symbols representing pitch and duration. Music no longer lived only in memory. It could be read, corrected, repeated, precisely. This shift was subtle, but profound. At the same time, military bands became a visible symbol of modernization. Uniformed musicians marched in formation, brass instruments gleaming in sunlight. Snare drums set the pace, each step synchronized, each note aligned. Sound became structure. Music became discipline, where traditional Japanese music often embraced flexible tempo, breathing with the performer. Military band music demanded precision, no lingering, no drifting. The downbeat was firm, collective, unquestioned. for a nation reshaping itself, this kind of sound carried meaning. Imagine a parade ground at twilight, boots moving in unison, trumpets cutting clean arcs of sound into the evening air. Behind them, wooden houses and paper lanterns, watching quietly, old and new, standing within the same frame, not yet blended, but undeniably connected. School songs, too, carried more than melody. They carried values, unity, order, progress. Children sang together, their individual voices merging into a single harmonic line. In that merging, a new cultural sound began to form. Not fully Western, not fully traditional, something in between. And yet, tradition did not disappear. Festivals continued. Temple drums echoed during summer nights. The shamisen still accompanied storytellers. The difference was this: Western sound was no longer a visitor. It had become part of daily life. The piano found its place in middle-class homes, often positioned near a window, sunlight falling across polished keys. At first, the instrument seemed foreign, heavy, angular, precise. But children learned quickly. Scales repeated, exercises practiced. Familiarity softened resistance. Music teachers played a quiet but crucial role. Many had studied abroad. Others learned from foreign instructors. They adapted Western curriculum to Japanese classrooms, sometimes translating lyrics, sometimes adjusting melodic phrasing. The process was not blind imitation. It was careful selection, adoption without surrender. There is something deeply human about learning through repetition. Voices rising together each morning, simple harmonies, predictable cadence. Over time, what once felt unfamiliar begins to feel natural, and what feels natural begins to shape identity. By the late 19th century, an entire generation had grown up with this dual inheritance. They knew the sound of temple bells. They also knew the sound of brass fanfares. They understood pentatonic scales. They also understood major and minor keys. Their ears had widened, and widened ears create new possibilities. But not all transitions are smooth. Some critics worried that Western music might overshadow tradition. Others believed it was essential for national strength. Debate unfolded quietly, not always in public speeches, but in practice rooms and rehearsal halls. Should music preserve the past or prepare the future? Perhaps it could do both. As evening settles, imagine a small town square. A military band rehearsal concludes. The final note lingers, precise and resonant. In the distance, a temple drum responds, slower, deeper, anchored in centuries. The two sounds do not clash, they overlap, each retaining its character, each shaping the other. In this overlapping space, something new begins to breathe. A generation raised on harmony will soon begin to compose. A nation trained in discipline will soon search for expression. The march and the chant will meet, but that meeting belongs to the next chapter. For now, rest in this moment of structure. Feel the steady pulse of measured rhythm, the calm repetition of classroom song, the steady cadence of footsteps on packed earth. Change does not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it arrives as practice, as routine, as a melody sung softly by children at dusk. And as voices fade into evening air, we step forward, not abruptly, but gradually, toward the rise of those who will take these new tools and shape them into something distinctly their own. Part 9. The Rise of Japanese Composers. The steady rhythm of practice had reshaped a generation. Children who once sang school songs now sat at pianos. Students who marched in band formations now studied harmony. The tools had arrived, the discipline had settled, and quietly a question began to form. If we can perform Western music, can we also create it? At first, composition felt like imitation. European forms were studied carefully. Sonatas, symphonies, art songs. Young musicians learned the architecture of sound, how themes develop, how harmonies resolve, how tension rises and releases. It was a different way of thinking, structured, layered, mathematical almost. And yet, within that structure, there was space. Space to shape something new. Among the early pioneers was a composer named Kosaku Yamada. He studied in Europe, absorbing German Romanticism. But when he returned home, he did not simply copy what he had learned. He listened again to Japanese folk melodies, to pentatonic scales, to the subtle bends of traditional song, and Slowly, he began weaving the two together. Imagine a melody that begins in a Western harmonic frame, but turns gently, unexpectedly, into a Japanese tonal color, a chord progression that moves forward with European logic, yet carries the emotional restraint of Japanese aesthetics. This was not collision, it was conversation. Composers of this era stood at a delicate threshold, too Western, and the music felt detached from home, too traditional, and it seemed disconnected from the modern world. Balance became an art, not dramatic fusion, but careful integration. Concert halls began to appear in cities. Audiences gathered, curious and attentive. They listened to orchestras perform works written by their own countrymen, music that sounded familiar, yet slightly transformed. The piano no longer felt foreign. The violin no longer felt distant. They had become instruments of Japanese expression. There is something intimate about hearing your own culture through a new lens. It is like seeing a childhood landscape illuminated by unfamiliar light. The shapes remain, but the shadows deepen, the contours sharpen, the meaning expands. Some compositions embraced lyricism. Art songs carried poetry in delicate phrases. Others experimented with orchestral texture, strings swelling gently, woodwinds tracing quiet arcs above them. But always there was restraint, a certain spaciousness. Even within Western harmony, silence remained respected. This was not accidental. Japanese aesthetic principles, the space between, continued to guide artistic instinct. Even when writing in symphonic form, composers allowed breath, allowed pause, allowed understatement. Western technique provided structure. Japanese sensibility provided soul. As decades passed, a distinctly modern Japanese sound emerged. It did not reject its influences. It did not deny its origins. It acknowledged both. In this acknowledgement, confidence grew. The question was no longer, can we compose Western music? It became, what is our voice within it? Imagine an evening recital. A pianist bows gently before sitting. The first notes are simple, measured, rooted in tonal harmony. But as the piece unfolds, a melody rises that feels unmistakably Japanese, not through cliché, not through ornament, but through pacing, through emotional restraint, through subtle asymmetry. The audience listens quietly. There is pride, not loud, not boastful, but steady. A recognition that something has shifted. Japan is no longer only absorbing sound, it is shaping it. The rise of Japanese composers marked more than artistic development. It marked cultural confidence, the ability to stand between worlds without dissolving into either, to borrow without losing oneself, to innovate without severing roots. And yet, this was still only the beginning. Beyond the concert hall, new technologies waited, devices that could carry music into homes. Without live performance, new rhythms of urban life were forming. The next transformation would not be about composition alone, but about distribution, about how sound travels. For now, rest in this quiet emergence. The image of a composer at dusk, papers scattered across a wooden desk, a candle flickering. Outside, the distant echo of a temple bell. Inside, the gentle progression of a Western chord. Two histories meeting, not in conflict, but in harmony. And as the final note fades, we turn toward a new chapter, where music leaves the concert hall and enters the airwaves.